All right. Josh was telling me that he couldn't stop laughing last week. Is that true? It might have been because of the law about no one can come into the presence of the Lord whose privy member is crushed or something like that. The privy member. So bizarre. The Bible, I'm telling you guys. Well, there's some laws here that are no less bizarre today. Here, let me do this, because we've done this a few times, but remember in chapter 4, at the now I'm already wishing I had the drawing. Oh well. The beginning of chapter 4, Moses gave the covenant sermons. It was the beginning of the covenant sermons as to why he's giving them all of these laws. And I've done this a few times, but it's just good for us to remember. In Deuteronomy 4, he has this key section where he says, I just have it up here on the screen. So I've taught you all these decrees and laws. He's going to go and expound upon them in the book. Observe them carefully, because this shows wisdom and understanding to the nations who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this nation is a wise and understanding people. And then he goes on, he says, what other nation is so great to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? In verse 8, what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today? Remember the word for righteous? Tzedek. Yeah, tzedek or tzedekah. Yeah. Tzedek, or for language geeks, tzedekah. It's the feminine form. So it gets translated as righteous, but it equals right relationships. That's the core idea. So a huge majority of these laws in 24 and 25 are basically pursuing this principle of wisdom and righteousness, or tzedakah. And most of the laws, there's a couple of exceptions, but most of the laws in 24 and in 25 are all about different ways of protecting the most vulnerable in Israelite society. So think of, you're probably familiar with it right now as we've been going through Deuteronomy. There's kind of a normal list of people who are mentioned as the most vulnerable in Israelite society in the book of Deuteronomy. Who are they? Widows? Orphans? Right, the Levite, because even though they have a job, they only get paid from Israel. And then the immigrants. And so the reason why they're the most vulnerable, again, everything's about the land. So we have farmers on ancestral lands, and the ancestral lands are all linked to each other by extended family networks. And so if you're a widow, because it's a patriarchal culture, your status in the community at least is at risk if the larger family doesn't take care of you, because women didn't own land in their culture. If you're an orphan, it means you're not connected to a family with land, and so you're kind of floating in their society. If you're an immigrant, you don't own land, because it's all about ancestry in the 12 tribes and so on. And so most of these laws are going to be about protecting or making sure that people who somehow fall through the cracks of that system don't actually fall completely through, but are taken care of in some way. So there's actually quite a lot of wisdom here about, justice, social justice, care for the poor, all kinds of things. So there's a lot of interesting things here. So let's just go for it and see what happens. The first law is verses 1 through 4. I'm sorry. To me, it's just, so it's 2014, and we're Americans on the other side of the planet reading these laws at 6:15 in the morning. Isn't that great? I mean, there's just something really interesting about that. Now, they're part of Scripture, but they're originally part of this people group that I'm not a part of, but here I am reading them. Okay, anyway. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if, after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and if her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, there's a lot of ifs. How many ifs was that? It was a lot of ifs. Then her first husband, who divorced her, is not allowed to marry her again after she's been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of Yahweh. Don't bring sin upon the land Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance. Well, first of all, there's so many fascinating things about this paragraph and about this law. You guys, this is the only law in the whole Torah concerning divorce and remarriage. So that's interesting. This is the only one. And is this really a law? What's this law really about, really? So you have all of these ifs. What's the main point of the law? Did you catch it? If. So if I say, like, if I'm really hungry in the morning, and if I'm willing to get out of bed, and if there's gas in the car, then I will go to the store. That's a long, complicated run-on sentence, and I would get bad marks for that. But what's the main point of the sentence? This is like grammar. We're doing grammar, and we're doing English grammar at 6:15. What's the main clause of the sentence? Then I will go to the store. And the ifs are called subordinate clauses, and they're left hanging out there. So in other words, the main point of this law is actually in verse 4. It's the only positive statement made in the whole thing. If you have been married to someone before, you can't marry them again. That's the law. That's the law right here. And this is the only law about divorce and remarriage, is that you can't marry the same person again if they have been married already after you. That's it. There's a number of things that are interesting here. One is, if the 613 laws in the Torah were meant to be a complete, comprehensive constitution of how Israelites should run their lives together, it's just a bad one. Because there's 1,000,001 life circumstances that are not envisioned in these laws. And divorce and remarriage is one of them. This is the only one. And it's really not about divorce and remarriage in general, is it? It's about one very specific circumstance that is probably a minority of the stories of divorce and remarriage in Israel. Does that make sense? Isn't that interesting? How many people on the whole have gotten divorced, then that person got remarried, then they divorced, and then they wanted to remarry that person again? It's a very small sample. So, throughout Jewish history, however, because this is the only law in the Torah about divorce and remarriage, especially in the period around Jesus, the rabbis tried to get out of this law a more comprehensive vision of what grounds for divorce are. So look at the first sentence again. So if a man, first of all, who is divorcing whom in this law? The man. Okay. So again, it's a patriarchal society. Were there laws providing for women to be able to sever the covenant? We don't know. There aren't any in the Torah, but we don't know. So this is all from the man's perspective. If a man marries a woman and she becomes displeasing to him, well, that sounds fairly arbitrary, doesn't it? And then why? What's the point? because he finds something indecent about her. Indecent. That's the New International Version. Any other translations there? Offensive. Any others? Oh, really? He finds something unclean. What translation is that? The New King James. Interesting. So indecent, offensive. Any others? Oh, there you go. And then unclean. Okay. So, literally, this is a phrase that occurs only here in the entire Hebrew Bible, is nakedness of a thing. Or in Hebrew, ervat davar. Ervat is nakedness of a thing. And the word davar is just the word, it's like the word thing in English, thing, a matter. And it's only used right here. And it's the grounds of the divorce. So not only is this the only law about divorce and remarriage in the Torah, the grounds for the divorce uses a phrase that nobody knows what it means. Right? So that's interesting too. So here's what's totally fascinating, is that there developed two schools of thought here within Judaism about what are legitimate grounds for divorce. And some rabbis thought that nakedness of a thing referred to something more broad, like offensive, like the husband just didn't like it or something like that, or doesn't like, displeasing. It's a little more subjective. Or there was a whole school of thought that thought the nakedness is referring to some kind of sexual infidelity. Can you think of a time when Jesus was forced to weigh in on this issue? Yes, indeed. Matthew chapter 19. In fact, it was this very passage that got brought up. Now, so just stop and think about those two schools of thought with me. Here, we'll do this. I'll put it up here because this might be easy. So what does ervat davar mean? There were two schools. One view among the rabbis was that it referred to anything displeasing. And then the other view was that it referred to some kind of sexual infidelity. Now, given the way the law is set up, which of those two is more likely to become abused in Israelite culture, right? So, yeah, obviously. And so with that in mind, knowing that that's the discussion in mind, look at how Jesus deals with this whole thing. This is Matthew chapter 19. When Jesus finished saying these things, he left Galilee, and he went into the region of Judea, the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Now some Pharisees came to test him. This is a common theme in the Gospels. So if they're testing him, do they actually really want to learn and know what he thinks? No, of course not. So it's a charged issue. It's a politically, religiously hot topic. Let's get Jesus to say what he thinks, and then everyone will know what camp he's in and that whole thing. They tried to do this a number of times. And so they ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, what interpretation are they alluding to then? So clearly, number one. Now, it doesn't say that they've adopted, that they hold that view, but they want to get Jesus to weigh in on this. And Jesus, this is so fascinating how he responds. He says, haven't you read the Bible? so insulting, right? They're Bible scholars, right? It's great. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, the Creator, quote, made them male and female. What's he quoting? Genesis, what chapter? Genesis 1. And then said, For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. What's he quoting there? Genesis chapter 2. So he quotes Genesis 1, Genesis 2. And then his famous line, so they are no longer two, but one flesh, therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. The plot thickens. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Now they're alluding to a law in the Torah, and which one is it? Deuteronomy 24. Now, there's a whole interpretation and assumption underneath how they're framing that. What is it? Command. Why command? Yeah, right? Do you see that the way they're framing the law is different than it's actually stated? What is the law in Deuteronomy 24? If you've been married to someone and then you got divorced and then they got married again and then they divorced, you can't remarry that person again. That's the law. That is the command. There's no other commands in this whole thing. The ifs are all just a setup to talk about the actual command. So did Moses in fact command? No, Jesus said. And look how Jesus responds. He says, yeah, listen, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Oh, I'm wishing I had the chalk. Oh, of all days, why didn't I draw the chalkboard? Dang it. I'm totally serious. Okay, anyway. So, because your hearts were hard. Have we heard of this theme before? The hard hearts of the Israelites. So if you suffered through the book of Numbers with us, you remember that was the whole theme. You'd have a narrative of how hard-hearted they are, and then what did they get after each narrative of having a hard heart? They got more blocks of laws, and then there was another narrative of their rebellion, and then another block of laws. And it happened like 5 different times throughout the book of Numbers. And so the whole way the Torah is set up is to get you to see that the more the Israelites reveal their resistance to God, the more he has to lock down and tell them exactly what to do, and the more they resist that, and so on. And that's the message of the Torah, is that the human heart is very hard. And so look at what Moses does here. Jesus does. He says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But listen, it wasn't this way from the beginning. So I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, marries another woman, commits adultery. Which interpretation does he take then? Two. Now, he's not the only Jewish teacher to have taken that view, but the reasons for taking that view are unique to him. No one else had ever made an argument quite like this before, at least that we know of. So, first of all, does Jesus view the laws in the Torah as God's perfect will for all places and all times? No. Go think about that one. So think about, no. What are the laws of the Torah? Well, first of all, they're given to the people of ancient Israel in the context of the covenant with them at Sinai. And a lot of the laws, apparently, are concessions to just having to deal with the hard realities of sinful humanity. And we've seen that, haven't we? The laws about war, for example. The laws about that captive woman, you have to shave her head and clip her nails and so on. So this is not a statement of God's ideal will. The laws of the Torah are a concession to Israel's hard-heartedness and the realism of just the broken, sinful world. And so it's interesting. God doesn't just say, well, if it can't be perfect, then forget it. The laws represent God accommodating to the realities of Israelite life. But notice also, where does Jesus go to find the ideal then? Notice he doesn't go to a prohibition, you shall not. He goes Actually, does Jesus go to a law? He doesn't. He goes to the story, the foundation story about the meaning of gender and marriage. He goes to the creation narrative. This is so interesting. So he uses one passage in the Torah that he sees as more foundational to help you interpret and understand another part of the Torah. So for Jesus, the creation narratives, not the whole science and evolution thing, that's not at all what he's talking about. He sees these as stories that make claims, theological claims about the nature of human beings and who we are and what we're here for and so on. And so he says, listen, male and female, Genesis 1, marriage covenant, two become one. That's God's ideal vision. And he uses that as his base point to then say, well, what are the implications of that for marriage and divorce? And so for Jesus, only something that severs or potentially tears apart the becoming one union, namely sexual infidelity, is legitimate grounds for divorce. Now, look at the disciples' response. Oh man, I don't want to get married. You see, that's their response. It's like, holy cow, I don't ever want to get married. I think that's funny. I think it's funny because I think they're realizing the gravity of what he's saying. Like, oh my gosh, this is so intense. The ideal vision of a Jesus-focused biblical view of the meaning and significance of marriage is crazy high. And Jesus is like, yeah, maybe some of you shouldn't, you know. It's a great passage. He doesn't say any of the things that you want him to say in this passage. So to me, this is fascinating for all kinds of reasons. This passage for me has become the most important one for pretty much all the ways that I am trying to make sense of sex and marriage and gender as a Christian, at least. Because to me it's significant. Jesus doesn't appeal to prohibitions, like don't do this and don't do that. He doesn't even appeal to the laws. He appeals to this foundation story. And then he explores it, lets its claim about the meaning of gender and marriage stand, and then he wants you to fill in the implications of it. And what are certain behaviors that violate this vision of marriage? And then Jesus says, listen, haven't you read your Bibles, never stopped and thought about it, and so on. Isn't this interesting? So there you go. So there's a whole bunch of other things about this law that are just puzzling. I'll just say I'm really glad that Jesus said what he had to say. For the most part, it's also utterly terrifying. Holy cow, it's terrifying. But I'm glad. The other thing, in terms of, remember we came back to this and said, this view right here obviously puts any Israelite wife in an extremely precarious place. Because especially if there weren't any laws for women to be able to initiate a divorce, this puts women in an extremely vulnerable place in their culture, because basically your husband can divorce you for any host of reasons, and you apparently can't do anything about it. And so it's interesting, Jesus takes the side or takes the interpretation that actually protects women from having this law being used against them in an abusive way. Does that make sense? So even though he's taking the more conservative interpretation, you would say, the effect in their cultural setting would be actually elevating and protecting the status of women in their culture. There you go. Jesus. He's awesome. Should we go on? Deuteronomy 24. You're like, are we ever going to get out the laws, Tim, if you take so long to talk about all of them? Okay, let's just go for it. Deuteronomy 24, verse 5. If a man has recently married, he must not be sent to war, or have any other duty laid upon him. For 1 year he is free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he has married. Nations will hear and say, what a wise and understanding nation. Who else has such righteous decrees and laws? Think about it. This section reads a lot like Proverbs, almost. The laws always have some like little insight in them that you should go think about. Hey, don't take a pair of millstones, not even the upper millstone, as security for a debt, because that would be taking a man's livelihood as his security. Millstones. Oh, I didn't look this up, but it'll just take a second. Capernaum. There's this cool, in Capernaum, which is the town where, here we go, where Jesus made his home base for announcing the kingdom. It's one of the most well-preserved first century Israelite villages up in Galilee. It's right by the Lake of Galilee. And there's this perfectly preserved old millstone right here. So you can see there's a big rock basin, and then somebody carved all this out. And then, what do you call this? A spoke? No, a pivot? A hub? Something like that, right? And then this would be the upper millstone. I'm at least as I assume. I don't know much about farming at all, but I remember being there and reading the little note beside it and so on. And then this would be, on top of this would have been some kind of wood thing with like spokes going out, and you would tie, like a donkey to it, or you could push it with people, and then you would put the grain that you want to crush in the middle of that thing, and then the stone would go around and crush it and so on. And that's how you make your daily bread. That's how you make your flour for daily bread in the family. So like a house, would have one of these, or there'd be one of these for a whole set of houses and so on. So if you're taking this, someone goes into debt, they borrow money from you, and you take this as a security for the debt, like the Airbnb. What do you call those things when you have to give them $200, but then you get it back again? What's that called? The security deposit. There you go, deposit. There you go, that's it. It's a deposit. So why can't you take Airbnb? I'm sorry. Why can't you take that? What's wrong with taking that? It's a great security deposit. They'll for sure pay you back. So what's wrong with that? So that's how are they going to have daily bread? If you take something that's a part of how they actually daily provide for themselves. And so what's this law doing? This law, it's not saying borrowing and lending is in itself inherently bad, but it is saying it is a practice that can be horribly abused. And so we'll see a number of other laws about working against the worst of human nature that is going to take advantage. And I remember a number of years ago, I heard this fascinating piece on NPR about the whole weird layer of our economy that's like the paycheck forwarding businesses, where you can go get a forward on your paycheck or whatever. And in what parts of a city are those almost always located? Middle class, middle upper class parts of town, lower income parts of town. It's an utter scam. And it's so outrageous that they're allowed in our culture. It's just utterly outrageous because the percentages that they charge for doing this, it's just total, you get in the hole so quickly and you can never ever get out of it. Anyway, in my mind, that's the kind of thing that this law is going against, about unjust practices in how you lend. Okay, verse 7. If a man is caught kidnapping one of his brother Israelites and treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. You must purge the evil from among you. What is the What's the value underneath this here? Well, if you're kidnapping and selling someone, what are you treating them like? Like property. And that violates their dignity as a fellow Israelite in lots of different ways. By the way, if Abraham's family would have observed this law, how many tribes of Israel would there be? One, Joseph, right? So actually two, and then Benjamin, because he was just a little guy at the time. So think of the Joseph story, right? You have 10 of the brothers who kidnap. They do exactly this, and it's a good thing, maybe, I don't know, that Abraham's family didn't follow this law. Okay, verse 8. In the case of leprous diseases, does everybody have leprous there? Leprous? Infectious skin diseases. Any others? If you have leprous diseases, do you have a footnote that says, hey, just so you know, this refers to skin issues more than what our word leprosy refers to? Yeah, so that is true. I think the technical term for leprosy, is it Hansen's disease? Hansen's disease. The one medically informed person in the room is nodding. Well, actually, Nick might not be the only medically informed person. Anyway, so when the Bible uses this word, it's referring just to an outbreak. It could be many, many different kinds of things. But outbreak skin diseases, be very careful to do exactly as the priests who are Levites instruct you. You must follow carefully what I have commanded them. What has Yahweh commanded them? Do you remember? Leviticus 13 and 14. It's great bedtime reading, trust me. It's all about that. And remember, skin, healthy, whole skin, was one of the ways the Israelites symbolized their worldview of God's holiness. And so if you had a skin disease, it doesn't mean you're sinful or evil or bad, but it does mean that you can't go into the courtyard of the temple or of the tabernacle. And that was one of the symbolic holiness markers that they had set up to remind themselves of the purity and wholeness and the healing power of Yahweh's holiness. So you had to wait till it heals and take a bath and that kind of thing. Remember, verse 9, what Yahweh your God did to Miriam along the way after you came out of Egypt. Do you remember what happened to Miriam? So she started a rebellion against her brother Moses in the wilderness. This is in Numbers chapter 12. And Yahweh's justice upon her rebellion was that she woke up with a skin disease. And then Moses prayed for his sister, and she was healed. So remember that. Verse 10, the Bible, you guys. Holy cow. Verse 10, now when you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, we're back into lending here, don't go into his house and get what he's offering as a pledge. Stay outside. Let the man to whom you're making the loan bring the pledge or the security deposit out to you. Now, if the man is poor, don't go to sleep with his security deposit in your possession. Return his cloak to him. Say, for example, it's his cloak. Return his cloak to him by sunset so that he can sleep in it. Then he will thank you, and it will be regarded as you know the word, as a tzedakah. As tzedakah in the sight of Yahweh your God. So the first thing is, if you're lending to someone and want a security deposit, you can't just go into their house and be like, I'll take this. Right? Isn't that interesting? You let them go in to their house and bring it out to you. So again, what's the wisdom principle here? It's trying to minimize the worst of what can happen. So this is a human being with dignity. They should be honored. They can choose and go get for themselves what they're going to give to you as a security deposit. You don't have power over them to just go take whatever you want. That's the idea here. Isn't this fascinating? And then if you're going to take something that is connected to their daily well-being, like their cloak, say they just only have one nice outer layer, then dude, you need to give it back to them so that they can sleep in it. You can't dehumanize people as you lend to them. Verse 14. Don't take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy, whether he's a brother Israelite or an immigrant living in one of your towns. I wonder if this is relevant at all, just at all, in our culture right now. Pay him his wages each day before sunset. He's poor, and he's counting on it. Otherwise, he may cry out to Yahweh against you, and you are done for. You will be guilty of sin. Holy cow, this is kind of intense. So this is obviously written to and addressing someone who'd be an employer. But apparently Yahweh cares a lot about the well-being of the poor and the needy, and if you hire them, you had better pay them a fair wage, and you better do it on time. That's the idea. It's laws like this that are at the root of a whole Catholic tradition in their theology and practice called, they call it God's preferential option for the poor. Have you guys heard this term before? That if you look at all of the laws about the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, and the poor, you'll notice that Yahweh always takes the side of defending the rights of the poor or of the vulnerable. Just add them up, There's 100 or so of the laws in the Torah are about this kind of protecting the vulnerable. Anyway, it's called preferential option. Google it. Preferential option for the poor. There's a whole tradition of Catholic writers and theologians kind of exploring this and its implications for how Christians should think about economics and justice and so on. Each one of these is a rabbit hole, and I'm just not going down it. Is that okay? Because I also want to get us through Deuteronomy. Okay. Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for their own sin. So in a legal context, so this is not talking about natural consequences of parents doing something stupid and then that has a negative effect. It's saying in a legal setting, a son can't stand in court in place of the father, and the father can't in place of the son. You can see all of these laws almost certainly are being given because of something horrible that happened that forced the law to have to be said in the first place. Verse 17. Don't deprive the immigrant, aliens in the Bible, Don't deprive the immigrant or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. There it is, immigrant, fatherless, and the widow. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and Yahweh your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. So, we've talked about these words before. So we have tzedakah, and then you have this word here, mishpat, which usually gets translated as justice, but it means a judicial action that creates tzedakah. That's kind of the easiest way to look at them. So tzedakah is the baseline, it's the core value. And then mishpat, or justice, are actions that you take in their judicial system to make sure that you protect and preserve tzedakah in the community. So, don't deprive the alien or the fatherless of mishpat. They should have every access to have their dignity protected as much as anybody else. Why? What's the reason for the law? Do you see it? You were slaves, and you were redeemed. That's why I command you to do this. It could be more explicit. So, in other words, they're a people group that wholly exist by Yahweh's grace, and they were an extremely vulnerable, oppressed group of people who, because Yahweh accomplished tzedakah and mishpat for them, that's why they exist. And so the logic then is that that's why you exist as a community. Don't ever forget that or build in ways of living as a people that violate that basic value. Now, this is really interesting. So, what's an example of depriving the widow or the immigrant of mishpat and tzedakah? Verse 19. Well, let's say you're harvesting in your field, and you overlook a sheaf. So you've got your plow and your sickle and so on, and you're going through and you're harvesting wheat, and then you get back, you finish a row, and then you look back and you're like, oh, I forgot that little section. Can you go back? It's your field, and like you've worked hard to grow that. Can you go back and get it? No. Yeah, don't go back and get it. Leave it for the immigrant, the fatherless, and the widow, so that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Let's say you're beating your olives from your trees. So that was common practice. You get a stick and hit the branches, and then whatever falls down to the ground, you put like blankets under the tree. And I got to do this one time. When we were living in Jerusalem. It was really fun. You just go around beating the trees with these sticks, and then you put blankets under, and then you gather up all the olives. So let's say the first time you beat the olives off the trees, don't go over the branches a second time. Well, what do you mean? It's my tree. It's my olives. I helped grow them. I worked hard. Do they belong to you, though? Leave it. Leave what remains for the immigrant, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest grapes in your vineyard, don't go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the immigrant, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt. That's why I'm commanding you to do this. Isn't this fascinating? So, first of all, is it your plot of land? If you're an Israelite, is it your plot of land? No. You're a tenant. It's Yahweh's land, and He gave it to you, to your ancestral tribes. And the work of the energy and all that. So this is back to Deuteronomy 8. Don't say to yourself, my strength and my power produced all of this wealth for me. It's totally a gift from Yahweh that you're even breathing and that you have land in the first place. And so there's this idea here of absolutely gain a profit from your field, sell it, provide for your family or whatever, but don't milk the thing out of so much profit that there's nothing left over. Now notice also what's happening in this law. This is, to me, is what's interesting, is that it also does not say, gather everything from the field and then go take some of it and give it to the poor, the fatherless, and the widow. The point is that you go over your field once, there is still work to be done in the field. But it's not work that's for you, it's work that you allow the vulnerable in the community to come and do so that they can work and provide for themselves as well. Does that make sense? It's really, so again, what a wise, understanding people. Now there was the tenth that every Israelite stored up and gave into the local food bank. That was back in Deuteronomy 14. But this is different. This is about creating an economic system so that there is always work and ways for the poor, the vulnerable, to find work easily and provide for themselves. And that if you're a landowner, if you're privileged and have the means, this is your obligation. And if you don't, you're apparently depriving the widow and the orphan and the immigrant, of mishpat and tzedakah. To not do this is to deprive them of mishpat and tzedakah, and that's wrong. This is I mean, I don't have really developed views on economics and these kinds of things, and I'm not trying to land us in any one category that exists today. I'm just saying, like, oh, this is interesting. The Bible is saying this. And some people might identify this with some form of socialism or something like that, to which I would just say, read your Bible and let it keep you up at night or something like that. I don't care. It's the Bible. Read it. And apparently, some form of communal well-being is a high, high value to the God of the Bible. Chapter 25. You want to just do some more? Let's just keep going. Let's keep going. All right. Let's say some guys are having a dispute, and they take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, and they will acquit the innocent and condemn the guilty. Now, let's say the guilty man ends up deserving to be beaten. Now, does it command, if he's guilty, I command you to beat him? So again, it doesn't say it. It just assumes that this is a practice. So let's say that according to your judicial system, it just assumes that some form of flogging or beating is how they operate. And what this law is going to do is try and minimize it being abused once again. So the judge shall make him lie down and have him flogged in his presence with the number of lashes his crimes deserve, but he must not give him more than 40. If he's flogged more than that, your brother will be degraded in your eyes. So, first of all, again, it just assumes that flogging or corporal punishment is part of their judicial system, but it's trying, so it's not commanding it, it's not saying this is the ideal, it's just saying this is how it was. And what it's trying to do, once again, is minimize abuse. So, for one reason or another, the number 40 is seen as like the highest maximum or ceiling for the worst kind of crime, which means that probably very few people got 40 because it's the most extreme. But for me, what's interesting is the reasoning that's given. Don't give him more, or don't punish him more than he deserves, because that will degrade him in your eyes. That's the reason. Isn't that interesting? It'll degrade him in your eyes. So there's a point at which, in punishing someone, it stops being about justice, because it's more than what they deserve, and then it starts being about the fact that you just have power over this person and you can do whatever the heck you want to do. And that's degrading them. It's dehumanizing them. So isn't this interesting? So if you're a judge, or if you're somebody bringing an accusation, you have a right to justice. What you don't have a right to do is dehumanize this person. There's a place for justice to take place, but you don't have a right to treat them as less than human or yourself as a more important human than them. Isn't that interesting? What a wise and understanding people. Hey, don't muzzle your ox while it's treading out the grain. That's so great. Okay, so let's go back to our millstone right here. This isn't quite a right example, but it'll do. So let's say you've got like a donkey or an ox tied up to one of the spokes coming out. Think of like spokes coming out and it's tied to one. And let's say, it's like going in a circle all day long. It's really boring and it's hard work. Don't muzzle him all day long while he's doing that. Now, why? If you muzzle him, what can't he do? The donkey, he or she, what can't he or she do? Yeah, can't take, a break and put the head over in the side and munch on some grain or something like that and eat. So the whole idea here is don't prevent your ox from eating while it's working. Let it eat, for goodness sakes. It's working for you. So let it eat. And that's the principle. And we've seen this already with regard to like the immigrant, the fatherless, and the widow, about letting them provide for themselves and work and giving them opportunity to do that. But then also you have this like animal. You have this animal, this view that your animals are also these creatures who are of value to God and that have a certain dignity that should be respected in how you use the animal strength. Isn't it interesting? Now, do you guys know that this strange little law gets picked up in the New Testament? Did you know that? Remember? We'll end here. 1 Corinthians 9. Where starting verse 8? Yes. Okay. So this is Paul the Apostle talking to the Corinthians, and he's talking about how the fact that he never, while Paul lived in Corinth and was planting the church and doing a lot of preaching and teaching and pastoral counseling and so on, he never asked for any money at all. He provided for himself. He worked for himself on the side as a leather worker. And instead of thanking him for never charging them or asking them to raise money for him, they actually looked down on him for it because they thought if he was a really stellar church planter or teacher, people should want to pay him and provide for him, whatever. So anyway, he goes through this whole long thing about how, yes, it is right to provide for the people who are serving in your church community. And look at what he says here. He says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard but doesn't get to eat some of the grapes? Who tends a flock but doesn't get to have some milk? Listen, am I just saying this on human authority? Doesn't the Torah say the same thing? For it's written in the Torah of Moses, don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Look at what he says here. Now, is it about oxen that God is concerned? Now, just stop right there. Is it about oxen that God is concerned in this law? Don't look at what Paul says. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Yes, absolutely. Yes, it is. Surely, he says this for us, doesn't he? Now, people have read into what Paul's doing is like that he's allegorizing or something like that. I don't think that's what he's saying. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Yes. Yes. Now, he's saying this for us, isn't he? In other words, I think he's reading this law as it's about oxen, but it's stating a principle that is for us. And in many ways, it's exactly what Moses says in chapter 4. These laws have wisdom and understanding in them. Yes, this is written for us. You need to pay attention to this ancient law about not muzzling an ox, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. Listen, if we sowed spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? But then he goes on to say, but hey, listen, I didn't use this right, never wanted to, and I never will. And then he goes on to talk about that. But isn't this interesting, the way he pulls out this law, and he actually develops a whole principle of it. And he's actually doing, I think, what Moses wants the reader to do, which is look at a larger principle of wisdom that's underneath these laws, and then all of a sudden it's like reading Deuteronomy becomes like reading the book of Proverbs, where it's these really valuable principles about day-to-day life and so on. How you guys doing? This was just like 50 minutes of sessioning the laws of the Torah right there. That was awesome. Maybe. I don't know how you feel about it. I feel great. Let me close in a word of prayer. And this was like a shotgun of things that just went out at us. So I'll just close us in a word of prayer.